All right, so up to this point, not gonna lie, video game adaptations have been with things like Assassin's Creed, Mortal Kombat, which personally I enjoy, but that's a whole nother story, and worst of all, Halo. There really hasn't been a live action adaptation aside from maybe the Sonic movies that has been universally accepted as just good. But I mean, we're one episode into this Last of Us TV show, and honestly, we're off to a great start. In this video, I'm gonna be sharing my thoughts on why I think that the first episode worked so well, some of the differences between the source material, which that being the game, and the actual TV show itself, and what I personally liked about the episode myself. If this is your first time finding me, I go by the name of Pizzo and I do all kinds of video game content, so make sure you hit the like and subscribe button to stay up to date with that content. Let's go ahead and jump into the video. Now, I will say I think that The Last of Us kind of benefits from being built for a TV series. Honestly, I don't think any of these big story films are really made for movies. Movies are like about 3 hours or so. TV shows have the benefit of being an hour each episode and having 9-10 episodes per season. And the fact of the matter is, trying to cram down 8, 9, 10, 12, however many hours of content and story development, character development into 3 hours, it hardly ever works. But the reason why I say that The Last of Us was kind of built for a TV show is because when you're playing the game, each chapter has roughly about an hour or so between character moments and cutscenes within each chapter of the game. One thing I think the TV show did well was being able to balance out keeping up newcomers that haven't heard of The Last of Us, so being able to like explain the virus and things like that while also keeping up with the story beats, the relationship between Joel and Tommy, Joel and Sara, Sara's last day. The show for me didn't really feel like it drug. I mean, with as many times as I've played through The Last of Us and knowing what was coming next, I was actually interested to see what the differences were going to be between the actual game and the TV show. And to my surprise, I mean, there's really not that big of a difference, at least between this first episode and the first 2 chapters of the game, that being Hometown and the Quarantine Zone. In fact, one of the biggest talking points of this first episode has been the whole first sequence, the Outbreak Day, essentially, following Sara around, seeing how things were between her and Joel before everything went left. And the fact that they were able to differentiate this from the game while also packing in as much fan service as possible. I mean, there were plenty of moments I was watching that TV show and thinking, oh yeah, that's a scene from the game. That's a scene from the game. Now, the spirit of the characters that I know from the game were there for the most part. The game story also gets expanded on, especially through the 1968 scene where the scientists were on the TV show kind of explaining that this could potentially be a serious issue for people, given that global warming is a thing. Really helped the actual TV show seem rooted in reality. And I think them pushing the time period back about 10 years kind of helps them, because I would find it hard to believe if people were on Twitter talking about somebody turning that nobody would take precautions in other areas. You know what I mean? Like, this takes place in 2003, so social media was very scarce, if it even existed. People were actually going outside, which is probably part of the reason why everybody was sick. But it also opens the door for them to expand the content in different ways in further seasons if they do decide to renew it for another season, which I'm pretty sure they will. The numbers were crazy, and Craig Mazin, Neil Druckmann, they've both said that they have plans, assuming that there's a demand for the TV show, and right now there is most definitely a demand. Now, Outbreak Day was a very important aspect of the story for them to nail, just because of all the different implications and different story moments that happened in that section of the game. And to see it brought to life like that was just chef's kiss, man, for real. But things like the gradual build up to complete and utter chaos, Joel and Tommy's relationship, and of course Sara's death, we're all given a decent amount of screen time. And the fact that these notes were executed so well makes me hopeful for the future of the season. This first episode, though, like I said, it definitely focuses on Sara, just like the in the game. You start out as Sara before you see Joel, before you see your dad, and there's complete and utter chaos from that point forward. But they did a good job of kind of expanding on Sara's character, because in the game, things happen so quick, and I think the reason why it works in the game is because of how suddenly we saw Joel lose his daughter. But in here, though, we're given time to see, their morning routine, their relationship with Tommy, the relationship to the neighbors, and how they move as a family unit. We see her go to her pop's drawer, get the watch, get the money, and she's in school. Maybe she's distracted. I'm not really sure what that little scene was leading up to that like cough. That was like the first little seed to let you know stuff was about to get real. But seeing her notice that her dad's been complaining about the watch, same way they did in the game, except this time we actually follow her to the store where she got the watch fixed. And speaking of that scene where she was in the watch shop, You know, that also plays into the gradual buildup of the outbreak day. I mean, yeah, we started out with a little cough. Oh yeah, actually, I think we may have started out with that grandma, the next door neighbor, was tweaking, bro. Oh my God. But that day specifically though, going from the cough to the shop and getting kicked out essentially, and then going home to find that same grandma that we was talking about was tweaking in that house with a trail of blood leading up to her chewing on her daughter's neck. That was honestly one of the best parts of the episode for me. And to be quite honest with you, I'm a little jealous of people that are just now experiencing The Last of Us through this TV show. There's a lot more context and intimacy between characters leading up to this point, which makes it hit hard in its own way. And going a little bit further into the ensuing chaos, I mean, that whole section of the game from the time that Joel pulled up to the time that he loses Sara, it was almost 1-to-1. Driving past the barn, driving past the family. Again, minor differences here or there. Nothing that would, you know, break the immersion from people that are familiar with the source material. But it made me look at the show as more of like an alternate timeline where things happen almost the same way, but you know, there's slight differences here and there to differentiate the different timeline or universe or whatever. Now, while I am saying so far so good, again, I've been hearing about changes that they've made to different characters. I'm going to wait for the episode to come out before I make judgment, but we'll see just how far from the source material we'll get going through this season. Speaking of differences, another difference that I really noticed was the difference in Joel and Tommy's relationship. Tommy in the show is a lot more irresponsible, right? You know, having to call Joel up after having a bar fight to come pick him up from jail, basically. And then also seeing how stressed out and, to be quite honest with you, annoyed Joel was with Tommy after having to do that. Kind of makes Tommy seem like more the little brother that you have to keep your eye on to keep him out of trouble. You know what I mean? But the reason why I feel like this is one of the more important differences between the game and the TV show is that in the game, when they get into that wreck, Joel checks on Sara, and right after he decides to check on Sara, he hands the gun that he has, his only form of protection against the zombies, over to Tommy, trusts him with his life, Sara's life, and trusts him to really keep them protected as he tries to get Sara to safety. Now, I'm sure part of the reason why they made this change to Joel and Tommy's relationship is to give Joel more of a reason to want to travel west with or without Ellie. Now, we've seen some promotional material of Tommy in a place that we know to be Jackson. We won't go too far into that because I do want to avoid spoilers for people that haven't played the game, but I'm gonna wait till then to kind of dive more into this, just to kind of see how this plays out. Last but not least, of course, the most important scene to nail in this first episode is Sara's death, by far. Part of what made Sara's death in the game so impactful, you know, was just seeing the caring relationship between Joel and Sara, and the writing in this episode was actually good because you actually saw that caring relationship. You know, you saw how loving and joking and caring that they were, just as they were in the video game, but expanded on even more. Now, me personally, I think that maybe because I've played the game so much, Sara's death in this TV show didn't hit as hard for me as some of the other people that I've spoken to so far. But again, I've seen this so many times. I know what's going to happen. The scene itself came off. It was pretty good, you know, and it was mostly due to the writing leading up to that point. Like I said, you know, setting up that relationship, seeing how they were as a family unit and things like that made the death impactful in its own way, right? They had the benefit of more character development because they don't have to focus on gameplay elements, you know what I mean? But the main thing that needed to get across in that scene was the feeling of loss. Loss is a huge part of both part 1 and part 2 of this game series, and I still did feel that. I'm not gonna lie, I definitely did feel that. The amount of chaos leading up to the point and being able to see how life generally was for them before the outbreak only served to benefit that scene alone. It was also important for them to set up the relationship between Sara and Joel beforehand because, you know, in the game, you really get to see how Joel is affected by Sara's death as you play the game in Boston, you know, when it's current day. And so for the show, instead of having to dwell on that because it would have come off as a little bit repetitive, right? They want to progress the story. They were able to, you know, talk about the Fireflies, talking about FEDRA, talk about, you know, Marlene, Ellie. They were juggling quite a few characters, you know, but some of these characters, they're going to show up in later episodes. You know, you won't get their complete arc through this first episode, of course. Now, speaking of the characters and the factions, I really think that they did a good job of keeping things mostly consistent between both of these different aspects. Joel and Sara are who I expected them to be. And of course, you know, like I said, they were expanded on. Tommy, again, We'll get a little bit further into it whenever he pops back up in the season, but there are some differences that don't break the immersion in the TV show, like I said earlier, but he does seem a little bit less responsible than he is in the game. Another character that was introduced this episode was Tess, and Tess's character is a bit different from the game. I mean, of course, she still has a thing for Joel. She still goes after Robert after getting double crossed, you know, the usual. But it was a little bit different seeing exactly how she got the scars before Joel sees her face and tries to, you know, mend some of her scars and whatnot. You kind of get to see how Tess is as a character when she's under pressure. And in the game, Tess really is a character that really focuses more on Ellie and expanding the larger world around why we're trying to transport Ellie. You know, Joel could care less. He would not be dealing with Ellie if it weren't for Tess, you know, wanting to do this favor for Marlene, in the game at least. So we really don't get enough time to actually get to know Tess as a character, although she is a W character for what she does. But, you know, we're gonna get on we'll get into that in the next episode. And speaking of episode 2, before I can make a full decision as to whether or not Tess's character is better, worse, or on par with the character in the game, again, we just got to watch that episode before I can make that decision. Overall, not enough for me to complain about. Again, it's really gonna be up to the next episode. Bella Ramsey as Ellie, I honestly, I will say I thought at the beginning was kind of miscast. But she was great in this episode. I mean, everything that I needed from Ellie as a character was on display. You know, a very snappy character that can hold her own, very opinionated, and she's young and doesn't really understand the severity of her importance, right? And it's significant when that little brief description of her character in the show also one-to-one applies to how she is in the game. Depending on how you're looking at it, you know, this could be seen as Joel's story or Ellie's story, but after having played part 2, this is 1000% Ellie's story, in my eyes at least. You know, of course, Hometown was Joel's villain origin story, but you know, we have a playthrough that I'll get into all of that. Speaking of the playthrough, we'll be playing through part 2 after this season is done as well, so we can kind of give you some insight as to what to expect in future seasons, possibly, maybe. But like I said, you know, Ellie was so important to Neil because she is the main character. And from what I've seen, I'm excited to see, you know, the different direction that they take with this character. You know, it's not going to be one-to-one, so we'll see the different choices that they make. But again, my hopes are high. When it comes to Marlene, Marlene is a recurring character in like 2 points in the game. So character development, there's really not enough there for me to make a comparison, but the fact that the voice actress that played her in the video game is actually the same person that plays her in the TV show, that's a W. That's a W. I will say this version of the Fireflies seems a little bit more militant and maybe more of an anarchist group, but I'll get into that when I actually talk about the Fireflies themselves. When it comes to FEDRA, you know, they are consistent with how they are in the game. Extermination over cure, you know, very tyrannical. They run these places. I've seen people compare them to like FEMA when it comes to like providing rations and different things like that for the community of Boston. So however you want to look at it, these guys are one of the villains in this story, which leads me to my final point about the Fireflies. Now in the game doesn't really do too much outside of like artifacts to establish, you know, what the Fireflies are like. But outside of artifacts, there's not much development of the Fireflies and of course, you know, the end of the game. But again, I don't want to get into spoilers, so we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But yeah, outside of that and the opening credits where it's just a bunch of radio chatter about if you're lost in the darkness, find the light, or look for the light, which is their mantra, same thing as it is in the game, you know. But because of the lack of development in the game, the expansion of the Fireflies and how they work in this first episode is almost immense. You get to see how Marlene is, how tactical she is, you know, her speaking to her general, her dynamics with her generals, the fact that there are people that sometimes question her, they question the cause. You know, this is all very interesting stuff, and I'm actually interested to see if they decide to take that anywhere, either further in this season or maybe in other seasons, who knows. But that's a very interesting aspect. Again, in the game, they are positioned as a rebel group, and because there's not enough information to question otherwise, you take it for what it is, basically. You know, they're described as a rebel group. Okay, it's a rebel group. Here, they are definitely more of an anarchist group that I from what I can see. And this is mainly from the scene where Tess is on her way back to Joel, and they decide to pick a fight with FEDRA. They have people set up in sniper nests on top of roofs and stuff like that, shooting at FEDRA, and innocent people are, you know, running away, trying to get to safety. And it's just, you know, it's just chaos. anarchy. But again, this is another one of those things we'll just have to keep our eye on throughout the season. I don't really have a problem with it, but yeah, I mean, again, this is a great episode, well written, well directed. Everybody came with their A game, so I really can't complain. I'll give this episode a 9.5 out of 10. Again, I'm very excited for where this could go. I'm excited to see the differences between the game and the TV show that they decide to choose further in the season, and just to kind of set some expectations. So far, they've covered the hometown chapter, the QZ chapter, and the beginning of the outskirts chapter. Now, the next episode is probably going to be the majority of the outskirts chapter before they head into Billstown. Again, no spoilers, but if you want an in-depth playthrough of the next chapter that's going to be covered in the next episode of the TV show tonight, go ahead and click here. And for a playthrough of what was covered in episode 1, go ahead and click here. I'll see y'all in the after show on Twitch.